With the money now secured, South Australia is one step closer to becoming a renewable energy superpower.
Australia is planning to spend $200 billion to create something that has never existed before, a massive inland sea in the heart of one of the world's most unforgiving deserts. A body of water larger than the Great Lakes, appearing where for millions of years there has been nothing but sand, salt, and death. This isn't science fiction. This is the most audacious engineering project in human history, one that could save Australia from climate catastrophe or become its greatest disaster. The stakes? The future of an entire continent. To understand why Australia would even consider such an insane project, you need to understand the geography of fear that has haunted this continent for centuries. Picture this: Australia is roughly the same size as the United States. But here's the terrifying reality: 80% of it is essentially uninhabitable desert. While America spreads its population across fertile plains and river valleys, 25 million Australians cling to a thin coastal strip, leaving an area the size of Texas and California combined almost completely empty. The early European settlers learned this the hard way. In the 1840s, explorer Charles Sturt led an expedition into the continent's heart, convinced he would find a mythical inland sea. Instead, his men nearly died of thirst and heat exhaustion. Sturt himself went temporarily blind from the sun's glare off the salt flats. He wrote in his journal, "This is a land God forgot to finish." Today, Central Australia remains a climate nightmare. Summer temperatures soar above 45 degrees Celsius, that's 113 degrees Fahrenheit. In winter, it can drop below freezing. Sometimes it doesn't rain for years. The soil is so salty that only thorny scrub survives. A simple bottle of water in remote areas can cost as much as a McDonald's meal. Take Sarah McKenzie, a fifth-generation farmer whose family has been battling this harsh land for over a century. Standing by her empty water tank, her weathered face tells the story of generations who refuse to give up. She represents thousands of families asking themselves the same impossible question: why stay in a land that seems determined to kill them? The answer, she says, is simple: this is home. But she's watching it die, watching her neighbors abandon the fight one by one. The man who first dared to dream of taming Australia's dead heart wasn't a politician or a businessman. He was an engineer whose previous project had become one of the most iconic structures in the world. John Bradfield, the genius behind the Sydney Harbour Bridge. In 1938, as Australia struggled through the Great Depression, Bradfield unveiled a plan so ambitious it took people's breath away. He called it simply the scheme. His vision, a 2,300-kilometer network of dams, canals, and pumping stations that would redirect tropical rivers from Queensland into Lake Eyre, a massive salt basin in the continent's center. The lake sits 15 meters below sea level, so water would flow there naturally. Bradfield promised miracles: green fields stretching to the horizon, new cities powered by hydroelectric stations, thousands of jobs. Australia transformed from a coastal nation into an agricultural superpower. During the Depression, it sounded like salvation itself. But there was a problem Bradfield couldn't solve. In Central Australia, the sun evaporates water 10 times faster than rain can replace it. Even with constant refilling, his inland sea would become a toxic, hypersaline dead zone. The project was quietly shelved, filed away as an impossible dream. Dr. James Mitchell, a leading hydrologist, explains the fatal flaw in Bradfield's vision from his university office, surrounded by maps and calculations. Bradfield was undoubtedly a brilliant engineer, Mitchell notes, but he fundamentally underestimated the physics of evaporation in that brutal climate. You can't simply create a sea and expect it to behave like a natural lake. Nature has rules, and those rules are not negotiable. While Bradfield's dream remained on paper, another nation decided to attempt something similar. What happened next became one of the greatest environmental disasters in human history, and a stark warning about the dangers of reshaping nature on a massive scale. In the 1960s, Soviet planners launched an ambitious project to transform the deserts of Central Asia into cotton fields. They built 40,000 kilometers of canals, longer than Earth's equator, to divert the rivers feeding the Aral Sea. The Aral Sea was the fourth largest lake on Earth, bigger than Ireland, up to 70 meters deep. Soviet engineers were certain of success. They called it humanity's victory over nature. By the 1980s, the tragedy was undeniable. The Aral Sea had shrunk by half. Fishing ports stood 40 kilometers from the retreating shore. Rusted ships sat on dry land like monuments to human arrogance. The human cost was devastating beyond measure. Oksana Petrov, standing beside the rusted hulks of abandoned fishing boats, represents the shattered dreams of an entire region. Her grandfather was a fisherman. Her father was a fisherman. She married a fisherman. For generations, her family's life revolved around the sea. Now there are no fish, no sea, no life, just salt and poison in the air that slowly kills their children. The consequences were apocalyptic. Toxic dust storms spread pesticides and salt across thousands of kilometers. Cancer rates soared. Child mortality became among the world's highest. 60,000 people lost their livelihoods overnight. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon visiting the dried seabed in 2010. This is one of the most shocking disasters on the planet. It's hard to believe that it isn't a natural disaster, but the result of human actions. The death of the Aral Sea became the ultimate argument against Australia's Inland Sea project. Environmentalists had a simple message: don't repeat the Soviet mistake. For decades, the Inland Sea remained a dangerous fantasy. But then Australia's climate reached a breaking point that changed everything. The summer of 2019-2020 became known as the Black Summer, a biblical apocalypse that consumed an area larger than the United Kingdom and Ireland combined. 3 billion animals burned alive. Smoke circled the entire globe. Michael O'Brien's voice still breaks when he recalls that horrific day at Malakuta Beach. 4,000 people trapped with nowhere to run, watching the sky turn an apocalyptic black and orange. The air temperature reached 48 degrees, hot enough to cause burns just by breathing. His children looked up at him with terrified eyes and asked the question no parent should ever have to answer: "Daddy, are we going to die?" In that moment, he didn't know what to tell them, but the fires were just the visible symptom of a deeper crisis. Since 2017, Eastern Australia had been experiencing the worst drought in 400 years of records. This wasn't just dry weather, it was a continental-scale water apocalypse. John McCartney stands in what was once a thriving paddock, now just cracked earth stretching to the horizon. His story represents thousands of similar tragedies across rural Australia. Last month, he was forced to shoot 400 head of cattle, not for profit, but as an act of mercy because they were dying of thirst. His family had maintained this farm for 70 years, passing it down through generations. Now he faces the terrible possibility that the legacy ends with him. He doesn't know if there will be anyone to carry on after he's gone. The numbers were staggering: 10 million cattle dead, wheat harvest down 20%, cotton production collapsed by 40%. The city of Sydney, home to 5 million people, came within 2 years of running completely dry. Even in major cities, life became unrecognizable. Melbourne residents were limited to 50 liters per day, 3-minute showers, laundry once a week, no lawn watering, no car washing. Police patrolled Sydney suburbs, finding anyone caught watering their gardens. Traditional solutions had failed. Australia had spent $50 billion on new reservoirs over 20 years. They stood empty. Desalination helped coastal cities but cost 5 times more than regular water and couldn't reach rural areas. The country was trapped in a deadly cycle: Less rain every year, more people needing water, an economy dependent on agriculture slowly dying. But while Australia burned, 3 technological revolutions were quietly making the impossible possible. First, solar energy. In just 2 decades, the cost of solar power had plummeted by 90%. Australia, one of the world's sunniest countries, could now power massive pumping stations almost for free. Second, desalination. New membrane technologies had made removing salt from seawater hundreds of times cheaper. Israel, UAE, and Saudi Arabia were already producing billions of liters daily. Third, mineral extraction. Scientists had developed ways to extract valuable materials, salt, lithium, magnesium, from seawater on an industrial scale. The waste product could become a source of profit. And finally, computer modeling. Scientists could now predict the effects of an inland sea on climate and ecosystems decades in advance, learning from past mistakes. In 2020, these technologies came together in a radical new proposal, Australian Inland Sea 2.0. The new plan was nothing like Bradfield's 1930 scheme. Instead of unreliable rivers, seawater. Instead of coal power, solar. Instead of fighting salt, harvesting it for profit. Picture this: giant desalination plants on the southern coast, powered by solar farms the size of entire cities. A pipeline network stretching 600 kilometers into the continent's heart. Pumping stations capable of moving ocean-sized volumes of water. The project would take 20 years of continuous construction and create a sea as large as the Great Lakes. Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the project's lead engineers, stands before massive technical display showing the proposed infrastructure. She explains that this isn't simply about creating water, they're talking about fundamentally altering the climate of Central Australia. Evaporation from the sea surface would create entirely new local weather patterns. Rainfall would increase within a radius of several hundred kilometers. They could witness the birth of agricultural zones where nothing but desert has existed for millions of years. But Dr. Rebecca Stone, an environmental scientist who has spent years studying desert ecosystems, offers a sobering counterpoint. Standing in the harsh landscape that would be transformed, she warns that they're essentially playing God with an entire continent's ecosystem. Even their most sophisticated computer models cannot predict every consequence. What if the salty water sterilizes the soil for hundreds of kilometers around? What if they inadvertently create destructive weather patterns? She reminds us that the Aral Sea disaster also began with the very best of intentions. Aaron Stewart, an elder of the Arabana people, stands at the edge of what outsiders call Lake Eyre, but what his people have known for over 60,000 years as Kati Thanda. His weathered hands gesture toward the ancient salt formations as he explains what the government planners cannot see. This isn't empty wasteland waiting to be improved. This is where his ancestors' spirits rest. Creation stories passed down through countless generations are written in this salt, in these rocks, in the very wind that blows across this sacred landscape. The proposed flooding, he says with quiet dignity, would be like drowning their entire history under an artificial sea. For 2 centuries, he continues, white settlers have looked at Aboriginal country and seen nothing but emptiness. Where they see wasteland, his people see the world's oldest living culture. Now, as Australia faces its climate crisis, the proposed solution is to destroy theirs. Professor David Wong, a leading expert in Indigenous rights law, explains the fundamental legal and moral questions this raises. The Arabana people never ceded this land through any treaty or agreement. Any project of this magnitude requires not just token consultation, but genuine partnership with the traditional owners who have been custodians of this country since time immemorial. The international response was as divided as it was passionate. BBC anchors asked whether this represented humanity's greatest engineering triumph or its next environmental disaster. CNN correspondents labeled it climate colonialism. Wealthy nations reshaping the planet while ignoring indigenous voices. Environmental groups launched worldwide campaigns with a simple, haunting message: don't let Australia become the next Aral Sea. Yet in the gleaming conference rooms of international finance, a very different conversation was taking place. Sovereign wealth funds from Norway, Singapore, and the Middle East began serious preliminary discussions. This represented exactly the kind of moonshot investment that could define the 21st century. High risk but potentially transformational returns. The digital battleground was equally intense. The hashtag #WarAustralianInlandSea trended globally across social media platforms. Supporters shared stunning visualizations of green cities rising like mirages from red desert. Critics countered with haunting satellite images of the dried Aral Sea. Climate scientists engaged in heated debates across Twitter threads, their professional disagreements spilling into public view. On the streets of major cities around the world, ordinary people grappled with the implications. In London, residents wondered if this could show the world how to reverse climate change, or whether failure might prove worse than Chernobyl. Tokyo business people, perhaps influenced by their nation's own history of ambitious mega projects, suggested that Australia had always been about taking impossible risks, and maybe that's exactly what the world needed. In Munich, environmentalists worried that this represented precisely the kind of technological arrogance that created the climate crisis in the first place. Behind closed doors in Canberra, Australia's leaders faced an impossible choice. The feasibility studies were complete, the environmental impact assessments were in, international investors were ready. But the clock was ticking. The latest climate projections were terrifying. By 2050, average temperatures would rise another 2 to 3 degrees. Rainfall would drop by 20%. Without radical intervention, much of Australia could become uninhabitable. Dr. Michelle Torres, analyzing the political dimensions from the halls of Parliament House, explains the unprecedented nature of this decision. This choice will define Australia for the next century, she observes. It transcends any single election, any political party, any individual leader. At its core lies the fundamental question that will determine the nation's survival. What are Australians willing to risk to secure their future? Meanwhile, farmers like Sarah McKenzie wait for an answer that will determine whether their children have any future on the land at all. Each day that passes without a decision, she says, costs her more hope. Her great-grandmother survived the devastating drought of the 1920s. Her grandmother endured the harsh conditions of the 1960s drought. But this current crisis might be the one that finally breaks the chain of generations, unless someone finds the courage to attempt something that seems impossible. As I record this, Australia stands at the edge of the greatest decision in its history. The government has committed to a final verdict by 2026. If approved, construction would begin by 2030 and take 2 decades to complete. We've met the dreamers and the skeptics, the farmers and the engineers, the traditional owners and the politicians, each carrying a piece of Australia's future in their hands. Dr. James Mitchell, returning to his office filled with maps and calculations, offers perhaps the most sobering perspective of all. History will judge this generation harshly if they do nothing and allow the continent to die, he warns. But history will judge them even more harshly if they act recklessly and create a disaster that persists for centuries. The fundamental question, he insists, isn't whether they can build an inland sea, it's whether they should. This is more than engineering, more than economics, more than politics. This is about humanity's willingness to take the greatest risk in history for the chance to reverse climate catastrophe. Will Australia create a miracle in the desert or repeat the greatest environmental disaster of the 20th century on an even larger scale? The world is watching, history is waiting, and time is running out. What do you think? Should Australia risk everything on this $200 billion gamble? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about humanity's greatest challenges.